Good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm stepping off the streets of the Windy City to bring you our very last screening of the fantastic For Loves in February film series. Tonight will be full of scares, chills, and genuinely great performances. But tonight's screening will also celebrate everything that makes February so great. That both being that it's a month that celebrates love, but also the fact that it's Black History Month. This film will tackle both in one nice, cohesive package. So in tonight's episode, you can expect us to deep dive into a film that tackles racism, the ghosts and monsters that result from a wrongful death, and visit upon one of the greatest antagonistic performances to ever grace the silver screen. All this and more on tonight's episode. I'm your host and curator around these parts, Patrick Smith, and this is Movie Club. Roll the intro, Steven! Welcome back, everyone, to Movie Club. And I'm just now realizing that I'm still dressed in my Chicago winter weather. So if you will pardon me for just a second, I'm going to change it to something a little bit more comfortable. Alright, that is much better. So welcome back to Movie Club. Tonight as we close out our February film series, the For Loves in February film series. Tonight's film is the culmination of everything we've talked about thus far. And it's why I put it at the end of the month, but also because it's a film that celebrates everything that makes February great. Which is, first, that it's a month that celebrates love, as I said in the intro, and also that it's Black History Month. And one of my favorite movies, not just in the horror genre, but just favorite cinematic experiences altogether, is this 1992 seminal horror classic featuring one of the most incredible villains in all of cinema. And that is Bernard Rose's 1992 film, Candyman. Now there's a lot of ingredients that make this particular film fantastic, so I'm going to start breaking down a couple of them. As I've mentioned in the past, some of the best horror films and just some of the best films in general are based on urban legends. Whether that's Black Christmas, using the trope of the killers in the house, or any other fantastic horror film that uses some sort of real-life murder or real-life crime or real-life urban legend story that has been passed down as an old wives' tale.
An urban legend is a story that everybody feels that they've heard it from somebody who was just 1 degree removed from the source of the story.
My friend heard it on the radio. It's true.
These stories have actually no basis in fact, yet people believe them with a passionate intensity. They obviously represent some kind of fundamental and profound fear that people have about modern urban societies.
Most specifically, it's a combination of 2 major urban legends. The first being Bloody Mary. Now, if you were ever a kid, which I imagine at least most of my audience was at least some point a kid, Bloody Mary was one of those things that you were dared to do as a kid, which is to go into the bathroom, flick off all the lights, and whisper Bloody Mary's name into the mirror over and over. And on the third utterance, she would come and get you. Now, when I mentioned this to my mother earlier, she thought that this was such a stupid idea. Why would you say their name? Why would you do that? And just see what would happen? Why would you test fate? Now, I myself never was dared to do such a thing. And maybe based on sheer superstition, I never would have tried that on my own. I was a scared little child, and if you told me that someone would pop out of the mirror and murder me, well, mirrors are already creepy things to begin with. I'm not messing with those demon portals. So, Bloody Mary can stay wherever the hell she is and not bother me. But needless to say, Bloody Mary is a popular urban legend. One that, at least maybe if you've never tried it yourself, you're aware of the rules. In some versions of the story, you have to take a candle in there, and that's your only light source. But in most of them, it's pitch black, just you being able to see based on whatever other light from exterior circumstances provide. The other is the urban legend of the hook. You know, man hand, hook hand, car door, that one, to less memify it. It's effectively the story of two people laid out one night having a date, and over the radio comes an announcement that someone has escaped from an insane asylum. One man with a hook for a hand. And at one point the girlfriend hears some scratching on the side of the car, and she gets her boyfriend to get out and look. Her boyfriend goes off and never returns. In the morning, the girl gets out of the car and finds the hook still clinging to her car door. If she'd gotten out much like her boyfriend, she would now be dead. Now, you mix these two urban legends up and you get some of the ingredients for this admittedly fantastic film, but you don't get all of it. And that's mostly because even though these urban legends are part of the ingredients here, it's not the main thing. And that is, it's based on a story called The Forbidden by Clive Barker.
Bernard based the screenplay for Candyman on a story from the Books of Blood collection by Clive Barker. It was called The Forbidden. The core of the story was about the journey into this crypt lair where this urban legend lived. The woman who was exploring it met a very grim ending.
Well, some things have definitely been changed for the screen. This is mostly a pretty true adaptation to Barker's original material. And Barker's original material was already based on these two, superstition, old wives' tale, urban legends, whatever you want to call them. But I would say, don't say urban too many times, otherwise you might summon Jared Leto, and we don't want to do that, because as he says, we live in a society. Pardon my meme, we'll get back to the discussion at hand. Barker is also a famous writer whose other works have been adapted to the screen, but most notably, we have his Hellraiser series. And if you haven't seen this, wow. It's a fascinating movie series that delves into very ethereal concepts and has this very particular brand of storytelling and dialogue a part of it. It's such an interesting movie. I don't know if me explaining it in its plot could do it justice. So if you haven't seen it by chance, I would recommend going out and renting the nastiest video cassette version you can find of it and just indulging yourself one late stormy night, because it's a fascinatingly dark love story too. But particularly the thing that I think influences Candyman as a film and as original tale by Barker, and most of Barker's material in fact, is the Gothic romance subgenre. Gothic fiction dates back to the 1760s, but probably got its highest highs, its peak, you might say, in the 1900s with Mary Shelley's fantastic novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Also notable in this genre is the 1897 novel from Bram Stoker, Dracula. Recent writers in the style include Stephen King, Anne Rice, and Toni Morrison. And one of the most recent examples is a film that both Gavin and I love, Guillermo del Toro's fantastic film, Crimson Peak, starring Mia Wasikowska, Rachel Weisz, and Tom Hiddleston. The reason Gothic fiction, but more specifically Gothic romance, is such an important lens to view this film through is because it's the genre this film is based in. While this is a horror picture, it is very much important to see it as the genre, specifically the subgenre that it is. This is a film that pulls influences from all over the map, but most specifically, some of its iconography, some of its imagery, and even some of its themes are pulled from the fantastic musical that I think we can now say very clearly is a horror musical, The Phantom of the Opera, from Andrew Lloyd Webber. One of the most popular musicals of all time is an example of horror literature, of horror media. And that's an important distinction. It's a fantastic piece of art, a fantastic musical, and, you know, it's kind of awesome that it's a part of this iconic genre. Because of its ties to this material that some critics might consider high art, I think that elevates Candyman from your typical slasher conventions, because you shouldn't think that. Maybe its sequels do delve into more boring, more clandestine genre conventions of just your typical horror fare, especially for everything that happened pre-Scream. But this original film is truly an unsung masterpiece. A film that deals with discussions about race, about prejudice, about segregation, and about so much more.
There are two big blots in American history. The first one is the massacre of the Aboriginal Americans, and the second was slavery. Essentially, those two events aren't tangential to American history, they are the real history of America.
My grandparents would talk about lynchings and being chased by the phantoms of the KKK.
In a horror film, you can address things like that, which if you addressed them in a straight drama, all the corporate naysayers go, "Oh, no, don't say that." In a horror film, it's like, oh, it's just some garbage, some bloody nonsense for the kids.
By the end of this film, it's hard to even hate the villain. Once you get to know what happened to him, what made him into this thing. And in Candyman, we get one of my best views of what a ghost is. Because the best version of a ghost is someone that died in a terrible crime that hasn't been able to move on yet. And Candyman is exactly that. Well, this film will go into it. I don't think it's much of a spoiler at this point. But Candyman was originally just a young man, born of a slave who worked as a painter for richer families, until he fell in love with one of his subjects, a white woman. After this woman was found to be pregnant, her family decided to seek revenge on this painter, cutting off his right hand and slathering him in honey until he was stung to death by bees. And now he's back, or at least the residents at a project center known as Cabrini Green in Chicago seem to think. And this finally brings us to our protagonist, Helen Lyle, played here by Virginia Madsen. Virginia Madsen doesn't play your typical damsel in distress. This is a very confident and headstrong individual, someone who wants what they want and takes the steps to get it. And at the time we meet her, she's a grad student pursuing writing a dissertation on myth and legend, but specifically urban legends and how they affect people in the real world. And she has just recently come across the legend of Candyman. She follows a trail of recent murder victims to a place out in the Chicago projects known as Cabrini Green, where residents believe this fictional man is back from the dead and is killing people there. Helen doesn't quite buy it, and thinks there must be a logical, rational, human explanation for this, and seeks to disprove it in her dissertation. In her disbelief, she says the name Candyman 5 times, not 3 times like the Bloody Mary myth, but you know, tomato, tomato, whatever, it doesn't really matter. She says his name 5 times into the mirror, and, well, that kicks off a series of events that become quite tragic for her, but also in a way darkly romantic, true to the subgenre this film is so deeply a part of. Because weirdly enough, our protagonist and antagonist have some real chemistry. And that brings me to our villain of the picture, or at least our antagonist. I guess you could argue the villain of this film is racism, but our antagonist is played by the 6'5" giant known as Tony Todd, a genre stalwart. This is a man who's been in a variety of films over the years, his first leading role being in the Tom Savini-directed remake of Night of the Living Dead, you know, my favorite film of all time, and a very iconic role in the early 2000s with the Final Destination series. But while those roles might be pretty notable for him, this is his calling card. Candyman is very close to his heart, and there's a reason for that. This is an iconic villain that, at the core of it, is just looking for love, looking to have the wrong righted in his life. Kazi Lemons here plays Helen Lyle's friend, and she's coming off pretty hot from the year prior, the 1991 Best Picture winner, Silence of the Lambs. While Lemons is a very notable actor, she also is a pretty great director, and most recently directed the fantastic biopic on Harriet Tubman, Harriet, from 2019. Now, I've mentioned it twice before, but I think now's the perfect time to get into one of the major settings for this film, and that is the Cabrini Green projects in Chicago.
Now that's Cabrini Green, not that you'd recognize it today.
Yeah, no kidding. I won't even drive past there. Heard a kid got shot there the other day.
Every day.
Now, the Chicago of the 90s was no stranger to segregation, but it was extremely racially divided during the time that this film was being made. And there was no better place that exemplified this in all of the city than the Cabrini Green projects. In fact, locals that weren't living in this place were afraid to even drive by it. And this only drew Bernard Rose, the director of this picture, even more to this forbidden place. He thought it was the perfect place to set a horror film because even the locals were a bit scared of it. Shooting there was kind of a terrifying prospect. The production actually had to make friends and make amends with a lot of the gangs that lived around there.
Well, they had to pay off people.
Bernard just hired the gang.
We did make a point of picking up local kids, both because it'd be good to give them a job and give them some money, and also because it helped our credibility.
You could really see that they were little kids. They were just teenagers.
We all on drugs, right?
We do build a mythology of what we expect in the projects. And there were, we ran into just a lot of families.
And in fact, some of the people that you see outside of the Cabrini Green projects throughout this film are those said gang members. They're the extras in this movie, effectively playing themselves. While they were dubbed over in post-production, this helped keep the peace mostly on set whenever they were shooting around these projects. But the production didn't go off without a hitch. At one point, there was a bullet found in the generator that powered this production, and on the final day of shooting on location at Cabrini Green, they were shot at in the production. Luckily, no one was hurt. And to this day, Chicago is still trying to rectify a lot of the racial issues that have plagued it, and plagued it back in the 90s. They're making progress through great activists that live there in the city, much like Chance the Rapper. It takes good advocates to help the city see everyone, no matter what color their skin is. And cities, much like the one that I live in here in Birmingham, still have a long way to go. I think one of the most damning things about watching this movie is, despite the fact that this film does try and have a really great dialogue about race, and nails a lot of it, I would argue, it does sometimes fall back into tropes of the era, specifically depictions of black men, and it's part of its problematic legacy. Luckily, this film is finally getting an update with a film that was sadly taken away from us, like many things last year in 2020, but will hopefully be released later this year. Co-written and produced by Jordan Peele, man who has appeared on Movie Club before, and directed by fantastic up-and-comer Nia DaCosta, we have a lot to look forward to, and this newfound vision will help finally bring a black person, specifically a black woman, to the director's chair to tell this iconic story of this iconic antagonist. And I cannot wait to see what DaCosta brings to the screen. This remake/reimagining, I'm not quite sure where it falls yet, features Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, as well as Tiana Paris, who currently is starring alongside quite a few actors on the Disney Plus original series WandaVision. So if you aren't already invested in her career, get on it, ladies and gentlemen. She is knocking it out of the park, and I cannot wait to see what she brings to the screen. Also important to the legacy of this film is the fantastic Philip Glass score. This is haunting horror cinema at its finest, and this music helps bring to life a lot more of the connections to the Phantom of the Opera, specifically due to the fact that Glass composed his score using just a piano, an organ, and orchestral voices. Shortly after the film premiered, Glass felt a little bit undercut by the final product, thinking that this film was going to be a lot more ethereal and high-minded than it actually ended up being. In recent years, especially in an interview from 2014, he's since softened his view on the film. While he still has never stated that he absolutely loves the final product, he is immensely proud of his score for the film, and says that he gets some pretty sizable residuals from continual screenings and streams of this film. So, good work, Mr. Glass. You did a fantastic score, and you've elevated what I believe to be a great film, even if you don't necessarily. Also behind the scenes, we have a fantastic cinematographer in the likes of Anthony B. Richmond. From the first shot of this film, you can tell that there's a master behind the camera. Because in 1992, getting these overhead smooth shots of Chicago were insanely difficult, and they were using a new technology known as Skycam. This allowed them to use a 500mm lens at an exceptionally smooth rate. And I think you'll agree, this kind of aerial cinematography is admittedly very hard, but they pull it off flawlessly. And that's in no small part due to Richmond. But Richmond's work doesn't just, end with the sky. He shoots this film and kind of moves through all kinds of different genre and lighting styles, including a Norse style at some points as well. It's his cinematography that helps contribute to, I think, what will be the enduring legacy of this film. I should talk a little bit about the production of this movie, because now that I've talked about the story, some of the actors involved, and some of the people behind the scenes, I think it's important to discuss this fact as well. Anytime Virginia Madsen's Helen Lyle comes into contact with Candyman, she develops this trance-like state. And that's because she's actually hypnotized. Prior to production beginning, Virginia Madsen and director Bernard Rose actually went and visited a hypnotist. And this resulted in Rose being granted a trigger word that would send Madsen into a hypnotic state. So whenever Rose needed Madsen to have this complete look of blankness, of complete transfixedness on the Candyman's character, he would just use this trigger word. Further into production, Madsen became more uncomfortable with it, and they had to stop using the process. But pretty much any time you see her with that look on her face, you can rest assured that she actually is hypnotized. Also of note is that the Candyman character, since he died by bees, he has a lot of bees, quite a few. And Tony Todd was a smart dude and negotiated a fee anytime he got stung by bees, that he would get an extra $1,000. While the exact number is still kind of out there, he made about $26,000 across 3 films that Candyman has been in so far. So I think he was pretty smart in that department, because that came on top of his actor's fee already. So that extra bonus must have been really nice, and probably helped him heal up a little bit from those bee wounds. Especially because there are some scenes where the bees are literally in his mouth. Like, dude, you have to be brave to do that. And one of the ways they accomplish this is by building a bee center on top of the production house. That way they could use bees that were less than 24 hours old.
The bees were organised by a very clever man called Norman Gary, who we'd first seen actually on the Johnny Carson show, performing covered in bees. He played the clarinet.
I really felt that he knew them by name.
Because I didn't know all these bee facts before I started researching for this film. So this is a little segment I'm going to call Bee Facts. Let's get ready for it. Because bees that are less than 24 hours old are still too young and don't quite have the amount of venom in their stingers, and their stingers aren't even fully developed yet. So they're less likely to sting people. This makes it a lot more safe for them to be on people's skin. The bee wrangler on this film also utilized a queen bee pheromone, which made the bees pretty dang complacent and would help them know where to go whenever they were in a scene and needed to sort of act, per se. This allowed both Tony Todd and Virginia Madsen to act with bees on them and to be relatively safe. And at the conclusion of a scene, they would use a harmless and pretty funny to watch bee vacuum to remove these tiny little bees from them. And if that's not the most adorable little thing ever, I don't know what you can say about it. Good lord, this movie made me love bees all the much more. Just, I want to hug them. But the bees almost made Virginia Madsen ditch this project altogether. And that's because she's actually deathly allergic to bees. So the fact that they not only had made this queen's bee pheromone, and they were effectively engineering these bees to be very complacent on set, made it possible for her to do this. One of the most interesting aspects in the first act of this film is when Helen and Bernie, played by Cassie Lemons, start investigating Candyman's murders in the Cabrini Green projects. They discover that behind the medicine cabinet there's actually a hole in the wall, which would have allowed a murderer to come in through and exit unbeknownst to anyone through a place that no one would think to look, and would make this look like someone had murdered someone and then just vanished. This was not completely fiction. When Rose was, researching for this film, he realized that someone had perpetrated crimes and murders exactly like this in the Chicago area. So this wasn't a piece of fiction from Barker. This was a piece of fact being stranger than fiction, and admittedly much darker than fiction. So you stir all this craziness together behind the scenes, and you mix together equal parts horror and romance, and you get this fantastic subgenre piece known as Gothic romance. And you somehow also get a film that is very nuanced in its portrayals, and I think is one of the best early 90s horror pictures. I mean, it is competing against some good stuff, like The Silence of the Lambs, and the film that changed horror for the better in 96, Scream. But this film also deserves to be recognized alongside those other two films, because it is important, and we're still talking about it all these years later. And so that's why tonight we're gonna sit back and close out our Four Loves in February film series with this fantastic movie. I love it with all my heart, and I think you will too. Whether or not you're typically a lover of the horror genre, this film does have a few jump scares. This is a film that I would argue is pretty high art and high concept as well.
The world is so scary that you almost need a Candyman to kind of release a general feeling of terror that we all have every day.
And it's not your typical horror fare as well, because you're not getting screaming final girls all the time. In fact, Bernard Rose hated that nonsense and would not have allowed that in his film.
How does somebody react when they see the monster? Are they going to be like Faye Ray and go, ah? It's very annoying to watch people screaming. And it's a fucking horrible noise, too.
So, in many ways, Candyman is in a league all of its own. It's its own thing. It's very different than most other horror that preceded it, and especially the horror that was coming out around this time. And that's why I'm so excited to share it with you tonight. Because you're gonna get to hear the sexy, sexy voice of Tony Todd in this iconic villainous role.
Be my victim.
Cheers, I'll drink to that, bro.
And you'll probably be just as transfixed as Virginia Madsen's Helen Lyle. Because this is a film that is totally worthy of your time, and I think if you give yourself to it, it'll be totally worth it. I don't think I've quite said the name enough, but without further ado, I hope you sit back, you relax, and enjoy a nice big bag of popcorn as we close out our Four Loves in February film series with the fantastic 1992 Bernard Rose helmed Candyman. I think that's 4 times. One more for good measure. Candyman. Did someone get the lights? Does a camera count as a mirror?
I'll see you soon.